I have detritus. I'll just move that. I have to tell you, actually, this bag I won at the Festival of Quilts in a competition. And I don't know who made it. And I know whenever you make bags for the Festival of Quilts, for the Quilters Guild, whoever made this bag, I'm never going to meet you, I'm sure, but I just want you to know, I absolutely adore this bag. I have used it for my sewing for the last 6 years, and I cannot believe how much I get into this bag, and I love it. So whoever did make it, I think I paid 50p for it, and I won it at the raffle. So cheers to you. Thank you. This is plain tonic water with a splash of lime juice in it, in a martini glass, because we feel a little more grown up. Just a little, just a little. Right, boys and girls, we are here today to watch Block 5. I don't know if you're backwards there. I apologise if you are. This is my summer quilt, and we are going to go through and do a quick recap. As some of you know and some of you don't know, this is very basic. You don't get to have the fancy smancy camera shot changes. That's just me. This is my dining room table. That is my living room. That is my garden. That is my little camera over there. Camera over there watching us. Bloop. So yeah, and that's my husband's painting behind and his little Liberty chair. So yeah, we have got, this is my home. This is me, so I apologise we haven't got the camera angles. Look, it's my zoom in is that, literally. So that is the quilt that we're going to be making. I'm going to do a little recap for you so that everybody knows what we were doing, what we have been doing, what's been in previous weeks and months. So this is going to be your block 1. That's what your block 1 looks like. And if you want a bit more of a visual representation, this is block 1 in 2 different colorways. This is the traditional colorway. And this is the colorway that Natasha chose in some gorgeous K-facet fabrics. Aren't they amazing? So that's block number 1. We've covered those in previous live feeds before. This one is block 2. Now, what I love about this quilt is what I try to do is not only are you getting the single block that you need for the quilt, because you need to make 4 of them, but if you get the pattern and you put it like that, you actually get a secondary flower, which I love. I love being able to do that. And of course, we did it in a different colorway, again, with a gorgeous cape. This is now block 2. I thought it was just good to give everybody a recap of where we are. That's block 2. Next, we've got block 3. Now, I've only done 1 of each of these in each color. So that was the original colorway that I chose there. But again, look how beautiful that looks in that cape. Oh, and I think it's called caladium. It's awful, and I apologize. I always want to say chlamydia, but it's not. It's a caladium. So that colorway there works very, very well. That's block 3. And then, of course, we've got block 4. I haven't made 4 of these, but you get the idea. If you wanted to merge these all together, you can see how they work. This is the traditional colorway that I'm suggesting. And then, of course, good old Kaif again. Gorgeous colorway there. That is the Kaif collection there, and that's block 4. And then block 5 that we're going to be doing today is this one. Now, in the collection, in the kit, for the quilt, you need to make 8 of these. And you can see how, even if you are doing just this block, look how pretty they look. You could do them in a whole collection of different colors and everything. So this is the block that we're going to make today. I'm doing it in my traditional colorway. This is foundation paper piecing. So in my little setup that I have here, I have my little page that I know is correct because I printed it. If you're getting, whether you're buying these as printed patterns or whether you're downloading them yourself, please always measure this and double check that the size here is the same as the size written on the bottom. There are 2 sections to be looking at. This darker inner circle over here, I'm not sure if I can zoom in on there, can I? Oh, I can. Look at me, I got all technical there. This dark line over there is your stitch line, and this outer line is your seam allowance line. So you're wanting the size will be from there to there, and as you can see on here, it is 5 inches on the dot. That is what we're looking for. So please, when you do get your piece, whether you've bought the pattern, it's been printed for you, or you're printing it yourself, please make sure that you've got it at the correct size. Measuring it at the beginning saves you a little bit of heartache in case you have printed it incorrectly. You need to be printing it, if you've downloaded the pattern, as printing it at actual size. All I'm doing now is I'm cutting off the excess piece of fabric, excuse me, excess pieces of paper, roughly between 1/4 and 1/2 inch past my seam allowance line. And you can see there, that's just there. So this is your seam line there. This is your seam allowance line, and I've just cut off a little bit extra there just to be able to make it a little bit more workable in order to do this. So now I'm going to do what I do every single time I do any form of FPP. The piece of fabric I'm using has normally been screwed up in a little ball in my fabric stash because of all the colorways that I choose. So I always press it. Now it is very important, any quilter, make sure you tell your husband you're pressing, you're not ironing. Because if you're ironing, they normally come and ask you to do something domesticated, like a sheet or a shirt or a trousers or something. But if you're pressing, you can just simply look at them and go, but I don't know how to iron. Try it. You never know. Might work. So what you're wanting to make sure is you've got as flat a piece of fabric to work with as possible. I have little bags that I store everything in. Each fabric that I have, Derek said, I laughed so hard I spat my tea out hearing that. I wish someone could do that to the fabric. Oh, that's very funny. Sorry, Derek. But there we go. You make this as flat as you can, only because when you start stitching it, you need to make sure that you haven't got any wrinkles. Like you can see over there, there's a nice big pleat there. Having that, when you do the foundation paper piecing, it may make your piece of fabric that little bit too wide, or you may not, it won't, it's just always better to do it this way. I prefer it. It's your fabric. Do whatever makes you happy with it. Right, so we only need 3 colorways here, and of course, there we go. So this is going to be the dark purple in the middle there. This pink is going to be this color here and this color here. Oh, pardon me, I feel a little thirsty. Tonic and lime juice, I promise. And then we've got the cream for the background. Now, I always tell people, if you think this needs to be, say, 6 inches by 5 inches, make it 8 inches by 6 inches or 8. The bigger it is, the better it is, because there is nothing worse than having to go and do these FPP pieces and then make an error. And when you make an error, you've then got to go and re-stitch it or unpick it and everything. So the way I do it is I take my ruler. I'm going to use a littler ruler. This is just a 6.5 inch square. This is the piece that I'm doing over here, my number 1 block over there. So I measure that across there, and that's roughly 2.5 inches by 1.5, but that's excluding seam allowances. So if I cut that 4 inches by 3 inches, that will be more than enough. And you can see my fabric here is 4.5 inches, so I'm going to go a little bit past 3 inches, and I need 4 of those. Now, I'm not too worried if I've got extras left over, because the more FPP that you do, the more you'll realize you will use your scraps as you go. And I'll show you a few tricks in doing this that will come in handy. Now, as you can see, the reason we make sure we press it is that you've got this beautiful fold in the middle there. By having that fold, it just doesn't sit right. So I'm just squirting some flatter on there, and I'm just trying to make sure that that goes as flat as it can be without having that fold in the middle. So you can see that that's now worked a lot better. It just makes for a better sewing experience, making sure that you've got all those little creases out. And if you don't, that's okay. So I need 4 cream pieces, which is there. Now the colors, are all in your pattern. So do make sure you just check your pattern as to exactly what you need to be doing there. And you can see I'm being very, very rough and ready with the amount and sizes that I'm doing this. I am cutting them a lot bigger than I need them to be. That little piece over there, you can tell I've got my width there perfectly. So this is the piece that we're stitching on here. So I've got more than enough seam allowance there, more than enough seam allowance there. I'd rather cut them bigger and have left over than not have enough. Now, FPP is one of those funny ones where it just takes a moment for you to figure out what it is you're doing, how you're doing it, and to wrap your head around the whole process. Forgive the strobing of this light. There is no way of turning it off. I do apologize. Nope, that doesn't help either, so I'll just keep that there. So what we're doing over here is it's all a bit like paint by numbers. And on here, you'll see that's number 1, that's number 2, that's number 3. So I'm going to sew number 1 to number 2, and then I'm going to sew this down this line over here. So I'm going to put fabric number 1, sew it onto fabric number 2. Now those two sections there will become fabric number 2. That is when I'm going to now sew onto fabric number 3. Now the reason I'm showing you this and the reason this is important is because when 1, 2 and 3 are sewn, you've now got number 4 all the way over here. But obviously 3 is over here, so how on earth is that going to work? So by being able to say that that's 1, 2 and 3, meaning that whole section is number 3, when I tell you you've got to sew onto number 4, that makes it a bit more easy to understand. So that's section 3, this is section 4. And when we've sewn those together, that means this whole section over here is section number 4. So when I come to sew on section number 5 over here, that makes a little bit more sense because it's just not this tiny little line between number 4 and 5 you're going to sew. You're going to sew along that big giant line all the way along. And then equally, number 6 over here and number 7. So that's the piece that we're going to do. Now with FPP, every single time, you're always going to have the right side of your paper on the outside. You can see there I've got my drawing on the outside there. And then on the other side, I've got the right side of my fabric. So when it's finished, you'll only have the right side of your fabric and the right side of your paper. Okay? So when you're sewing it, you're going to have the right side of your fabric facing out, but the wrong side of your fabric facing the wrong side of the paper. Now, the reason I tell you this is it's because it's a little easier to understand when I say wrong side of the fabric and wrong side of the paper, because a lot of times people will get this wrong. Okay, so I've just realized I did this wrong way around, forgive me. So number 1 is my fabric over there. So wrong side of the paper to the wrong side of the fabric, just like as I said before. And I'm making sure that I get this in place. Now what you're looking to do, annoyingly, I'm not sure if I show that up this way. Will you be able to see? Possibly not. But what you're looking to do is to check that your fabric here goes past the 1/4 inch seam allowance over here, past the seam allowance over here, and past your seam allowance over here. So in other words, wherever you have a seam allowance and wherever you have that little triangle, you need to have enough fabric to go around it. So what I've done there is you can tell I'm really far past the 1/4 inch seam allowance. But when I fold this, you can see that the fold of the paper is actually just there. So there is a chance that this may not be enough for your seam allowance. So I always just drag it a little bit over because you can see you're going over there. You've got that fold line. That's the stitch line between number 1 and 2 that I've just pressed. So that's number 2, that's number 1. And by holding your fabric there, you can see I'm well past that seam allowance there. We've got more than enough fabric there. Fabric 1 is now in the correct position. So now that I've got that in the correct position, so number 1 is there to stay, I then take the right side of my purple and I put it onto the right side of my cream. Now the reason this is important is when I'm doing fabric like this, the right side of my cream and the right side of my purple may very well be patterned. If it's not, that's not a problem, so you've got one less thing to worry about. And because I've already folded on that seam line, can you see that line there? That's where my stitches are going to go. So as long as I've got my purple there, a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch past that folded seam line, I know I'm going to be in the right place in order to get my fabric to sit nicely. And then all I'm going to do is just position this in the right place for it to cover my number 2 area over there. And you can fold this back and you see, goodness me, you've got loads of space all the way around here. This is your seam allowance there. And if I fold that back, you can see I'm way past there. So when you're happy and you're in the position where you think you're in the right place, please, by all means, pin this if you'd like to. I don't pin. I apologize for the strobing. I do apologize. I'm not sure how to fix that. And all you're doing now is you stitch 1 or 2 stitches before the seam line, and I always stitch 1 or 2 stitches after the seam line, and you sew directly onto that seam line there between numbers 1 and number 2. And then you can tell that you've got your seams together, these two are the right sides together, and everything past this 1/4 inch seam over here is going to be your offcuts. That's going to be what you leave behind. So what I do next is I fold that back, I get my threads over, I make sure that my fabric is lined up beautifully, I take a little ruler and I line my 1/4 inch line up with the seam line over here, and I trim off all of that excess. Now that's quite a big triangle that may come in handy later. We'll put that to one side. Okay, so now I've done it. I've trimmed it. I've trimmed off the excess fabric over here. All that's left for me to do is to go and press. So to press, I hold my iron down on the seam to keep it going. And then I just use the nose of my iron and I push that little purple fabric over a little bit. And I'll give you a few tips on this as well. So once I've got that nice and flat, what you're looking for is when you look on the side that you've got a perfect, you haven't got an overlap. So this is pretty good. You can't see the stitching. So as I hold that there, you can't see any white stitches coming out. So I haven't overpressed it and I haven't got an overhang of fabric. So if I'd done that, for example, you can see I've got an overhang at this point. That's not what you want, because when you're doing all the stitching, you want to make sure that it is as flat as possible. And because when you're doing all this remarkable seaming, you want to make sure that all of your lines match perfectly. So you can see that's nice and flat. There's no overhang. There's no, flappy bits. And you're now ready to just quite simply do exactly the same thing again. We've done number 1 to number 2, so those 2 pieces are now, in my mind, called number 2. And I'm now going to fold and put this onto number 3 over here. So just like what we did before, I'm going to fold on the seam line where I'm going to be stitching. I'm going to fold on that line. I'm going to give it a reasonably good press, because when I turn that back, you'll see that's where my seam line is. Now, occasionally, in this case it doesn't, but occasionally, when you fold this, oh my goodness, actually, oh my goodness, this is enough. So you know this little bit that I offcut over here, as I fold this back on the seam allowance, you can actually tell that's going to fit beautifully right there. So what you're looking to do, let me just double check this, sorry, I'm getting enthusiastically overwhelmed. Yep, I'm happy with that. So what you're looking to do is when you fold this forward, you follow the line of the triangle for A3. You can see that's the line for the A3. If this the cream triangle you're stitching on is within there with the seam allowance, then that is exactly what you're looking for. And then if that's right, and if you get this wrong, I have a box of chocolates nearby. So if you get it wrong, you can at least then comfort yourself with a little beverage or a treat of some kind to make things feel a little better. Now, what I'm going to do now is, again, this is all the excess that you don't need. So anything this side of the seam allowance you don't need. So you just fold that back along the stitch line, fold that nice and flat, line that up, use your ruler to get that 1/4 inch seam again. Line your 1/4 inch seam, your 1/4 inch mark up to the seam. And fingers crossed. Oh, I am a happy bunny. I'm now setting my seam over there, and then using the nose of my iron, I just gently press along that seam and go from there. And you can see I have now got that seam on there perfectly. Now, annoyingly, I don't have a really bright light to shine behind this, but you'll see I am a hair short over there. And I'm okay with that because this is just a sample. And there we go. I am completely happy with numbers 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so number 4 is this section over here, and we know that's the smaller part of our pink fabric. So just like what we've done before, I'm going to fold this on the line where my stitching should go, on my seam line between numbers 3 and 4. I'm folding that on there to see where I am. I'm taking my piece of pink fabric, I'm lining this up, checking that I've got enough of a seam allowance on the bottom line. So where number 4 is over here, I want to make sure I've got a 1/4 of an inch seam line over here. And I then just quite simply stitch along that 3, 4 line there. Ooh, I think that actually worked really well, and so it did. So just like before, this is the excess, so where your seam stitch line is here. Everything on this side of your stitch line towards your raw edges is what you're going to get rid of. So you fold that back on itself. You pull your threads forward that you've got excess, and all you do next is you trim that down. Now my little ruler is a little bit too short for this seam, so I'm switching to a larger ruler, and then you just simply trim off the excess that you have over here, and that bit you definitely keep for another project. Okay, we're almost there, only 3 more seams to go, so I'm going to just set my seam over there on the iron, set my seam, and just very gently then take the nose of my iron, and I'm going to press that back, making sure that I can't see any stitch mark, any stitches, and I've also not got any folds or pleats in my fabric, meaning my line isn't quite as crisp as it could be. That is what we're looking for there. You can see there's no folding over, and on this side you can't see any stitches. So we've now done number 1 to number 2 to number 3 to number 4. So this whole section in my mind is number 4, and I'm now going to sew it on to number 5, which is this big section over here. Again, exactly like we've done before, I'm going to fold on my 4, 5 stitch line, fold that along there, boom, 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 and you can see that is going to be where my stitch line is there. I know on the raw edge is where the raw edge of this is going to go, so as long as I line this up to the stitch line, you can see that is exactly where the stitch line is. I then go a 1/4 of an inch past that stitch line to be able to make sure I've got my perfect seam allowance there. And if I fold that back, this is a perfect example of showing you how you've got more than enough fabric to go around everything. Now, as you get more and more versed with FPP, when you do this, you'll see that when you trim this off, you're going to have this big wodge of fabric here, and you're going to have a nice little bit of wodge of fabric there. But now, if I just slid this down, bear with, caller, bear with. If I slid that down to there, and I fold this back, there's my seam line for the next piece. That's my 1/4 inch seam. I've got a much more usable piece of fabric here that I can then offcut and be able to use. So the more practiced with this that you get, and the more versed at this you get, you'll be able to then position your fabric, not only that it is enough to cover the piece that you're looking to fill, but also that your excess fabric that you've got left over is A, usable, and B, in a size that is actually going to help you in other projects or whatever it is you need. Because this block, for example, you need to make 8 of this block for this quilt. So having that little bit of extra fabric will actually make your life that little bit easier, because it'll mean that you could very well get 2 of these out of 1 piece, because when you cut down there, this leftover piece may very well fill that section on another one of the blocks that you've got to do. So we've now positioned that nicely. That's my seam allowance there. This is the raw edge I need to just make sure is 1/4 of an inch. And all of these raw edges, I need to make sure that they're all 1/4 of an inch. And all I'm doing next is lining my ruler up and trimming all of that away because we don't need those little slithers that are left over. And at this point, you then, again, just like the previous pieces, we set your seam and fold it forward. I'm setting my seam now, and I fold that forward. Using the nose of my iron to make sure that I've pressed it down completely and neatly and as flat as it'll go. My iron has turned its temperature down a little bit, so apologies, this is taking a little longer than I expected. Now, when I said to you, when you press and you can't see any stitches, can you see over here? You can see those 2 little white stitches there. That's what you don't want. So if that happens to you, all I would say to you is just use your finger, and you can see I've fixed it already. I've just moved that fabric a little bit forward so you can't really see the stitches there. You just do that and then just press that down. The rest of that seam looks absolutely beautiful. I'm very, very happy with that. And at this point, because I've got so much, because I've got so much fabric left over here, I'm just going to go and trim this side down. I'm not trimming it on my seam line, and I'm not trimming it on my stitch line. I'm going about 1/8 of an inch past my seam allowance line, and you can still see I've got some space between my seam allowance line and the edge of the paper. But this piece of fabric here is quite a big piece, and you can tell it's not quite enough to fit on this section over here, but it is definitely big enough to fit this section here. So being able to just move that fabric down a little bit has meant that you've got a bit extra fabric left over to save you cutting into another piece. So now we've got our A6 line. So we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we've sewn on number 5. So this whole section that's completed, I call number 5. We've now got number 6 over here. Now this is a leftover piece that I had from a little while ago. I'm going to pop that on there, fold forward and see if it's going to fit. And you know what? Okay, so that would fit. That would fit very well. You can see that that would fit very well, except there's a dead end over there. So when you fold this forward, you've got to be careful where the dead end is over there. Is that in your seam allowance or is it over there? And if it's in the seam allowance, just manipulate your fabric to see if it's going to work. And if it doesn't, cut yourself another piece of fabric. Luckily in this situation, I've been able to maneuver it. So as I fold that forward, you can see that that seam now goes past this line. And you can see that this seam over here is past my seam allowance over there. So you have actually got enough fabric to make this work. My advice is cut yourself another piece. This is when you've been doing it for a while, you're feeling confident with your fabric, you're feeling confident with FBP, you give it a go. But if it goes wrong, please remember, always cut the piece of fabric you think you need bigger than you need it to be in your head, because it is much easier having more fabric to cut away than less fabric than when you have to unpick. My other rule is if you have to unpick it twice, do the block again. Okay, now I've cut the edge off there. I'm now going to fold this back. Oh, I love it when a plan comes together. I'm going to set that seam. I'm not pivoting it. You've seen people press before. Set that seam. And we've only got one more seam to go. So you can see that covers it there. And as I turn that round, we've got more than enough space on there. It's lovely. So this little flappy bit over here, we don't need that there. So just like what I did on the other side, I'm just going to go 1/8 of an inch past my seam allowance, not the stitch line, the seam allowance, and just get rid of that excess piece of fabric over there. Okay, so all that's left now is we've done number 1 to 2, 2 to 3, number 3 to number 4. That became number 4. then onto number 5. Number 5 went on to number 6. So this whole section in my mind is now called number 6. And now all I'm doing is going on to number 7. Now at this point, you'll see you've got loads of little threads there. I always just take a moment and trim all these little threads off, because when you pull the papers out and you come to put all this together, if you do it as you go, it just means you don't have loads and loads of little cotton threads hanging around to try and get rid of at the end of the process. So we've just got one last seam to go. I'm going to fold up between the 6-7 stitch line, fold that up there, take the little piece of fabric that I'm going to stitch on. I'm going to line it up on one end, making sure that I cover my seam allowance all the way along. That didn't quite cover it. So just take your time for this process. And now I can see that's more than enough fabric over there to cover it. I've got all my seam allowances covered. And now I just stitch the 6-7 line. Okay. Now at this point, again, you've got your seam allowance here. These are the raw edges you want to trim down. I fold all of that back on itself. And these little edges, I just take my ruler, line the ruler up, the 1/4 inch of the ruler up to the seam allowance, sorry, to the seam line, and I trim off all of my excess there. Okay, so you can see that's your stitch line over there. Oh, you can't really tell it there. And all I'm going to do now is set my seam again. Set my seam again. Remember, you're pressing, you're not ironing. You fold that back. Use the nose of your iron. I'm hoping the little Tweety birds in my garden are not keeping you distracted. And now, this is now ready to trim up, okay? Trimming up is really, really important. What I want you to just notice is on this block, this dark line over here, I'm going to do that so it focuses. This line over here is the seam line that you're going to use to go and stitch all your blocks together. And then this thin little line over here is your seam allowance. Now, unfortunately, my camera is not quite focusing as I'd hoped it would. Hopefully, if I keep my hand still, it will. Where you've got your seam line, which is that dark line above A3, you'll see there's a faint line just above that, which is your seam allowance. But you'll see there's a bit of a gap between the seam allowance. You can see I've left a consistent gap all the way around. On all the blocks that I do, it doesn't matter which project it is, I always leave the same amount around every block. And what I do is I try and use the same ruler every time, or the same brand of ruler. And what I do is I line my 1/4 inch. Let's see if this actually works. So you can see right there, my 1/4 inch line here, at that point, is lined up exactly onto my seam allowance. But what I always do is I move it ever so slightly there, so you can see that my seam allowance is actually a little bit past. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Apologies. Sorry, let me do that again. I line my 1/4 inch up over here with my stitch line, not my seam allowance. Apologies. My 1/4 inch up with my stitch line. So you can see that the 1/4 inch, so that first one there, that one there, this one here is the 1/4 inch line. So you can see this 1/4 inch line is now perfectly on my stitch line. So if I move it ever so slightly this way, you can then see that the seam allowance line has come out a little bit there. So if I cut this too small, I'm going to cut my stitch seam allowance off. But if I take it the other way, like that, and I'm consistent and I cut it that way in every single block, when I come to put the blocks together, they are universal. They're all the same. I don't need to line everything up. In theory, it doesn't always work, but we try. In theory then, when you put these two pieces together, even these were stitched on different sewing machines. When I come to put these two together, if I've cut the exact same seam allowance all the way around, these blocks should naturally just go bloop. You stitch them and they'll match exactly. It doesn't always work that way, but that is the theory behind it. But the trick is always to use the same ruler. Now, annoyingly, I have lost my little 2.5 by 12.5 inch ruler. I put it somewhere safe. I can't find it. It's with a book. If you find it, it's mine. But I've used another Omni Grip. This is a 17.5 by 2.5 inch ruler. The reason I'm using this one, it's cumbersome, it's a bit big, it's driving me mad, but it's exactly the same markings on this ruler as it is the other. So then I know this is consistent. So if you're going to use your little So Easy red triangle, that's absolutely fine. Just be consistent all the way along throughout the whole process. So all I'm doing now is, as I showed you before, I am cutting this just past the seam allowance. So you can still see the seam allowance line, and you can still see a tiny little bit of space in between it. And I will trim this one and then move the camera down so you can see what I'm doing. So all I'm doing now is I'm lining up my 1/4 inch onto my stitch line, and then I'm taking it a little bit over and trimming off that excess that I've got over there. Oh, there we go. At this point, you will find that your blade may very well be giving you a little bit of trouble at this point. Make sure at this point you change your blade. You do need to change your blade much more regularly whilst doing FPP because you're cutting through paper. So just make sure that you stay on top of that. And remember, the blade is a lot cheaper than a new wrist or new shoulder or new something. And there is our block. Now, I said to you before that when I do these, I'll go like that first of all. I like to try and be able to give people the option of having 4 of these together to make an alternate block. And you can see how that would work out there. And these you can do in different colorway. You can do it with K-Facet, but it's just a really lovely, simple block to be able to just give FPP a go, try it out, see what it looks like. And please make sure you share some photographs with me. I'm going to just go through the live chat and see if I've missed any chats along the way. Nope, it was just Derek spitting his tea out with a comment about the fabric. Hope you all have a lovely day. Look after yourselves, and I will probably be live feeding number 6 because I haven't started it yet. And for that one, you will need a gin and tonic. So cheers with my tonic and lime juice. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.